at my age, like many of you, I suspect, or some of you, reflecting about all my life's mistakes. I could probably write a book about all my mistakes, uh, but I won't talk about those today. At the same time, I'm dealing with another concept that's related perhaps to our age or to my age. As I clean out my office at McMaster University after 52 years of service there, and my home office as well, because I have stuff between the two places. And there, the concept that I'm more interested in, I just give you a brief story tonight, called missed opportunities, not the same as mistakes. I briefly describe one. 1989, I was in charge of bringing in guest speakers into the political science department, practitioners and academics, both kinds. In my early years, we had plenty of money to bring in practitioners, which I personally learned a great deal from and enjoyed. Bringing in people like Alvin Hamilton, who was Minister of Agriculture, opened up China to Canadian wheat. Judy LaMarche, long-term 1960s Liberal cabinet minister. And in 1 week with a third person who I probably learned more about politics in that 1 week than any 1 week of my year, and that was with the former Premier of Saskatchewan, Tommy Douglas. But by the mid-1970s, that money to bring in practitioners, legislators, was drying up. But we still had a lot of people who would write to me, and say, I want to come talk to your students. I'll just please pay my expenses, put me up for a while. And we would get interesting people from all over Canada, from the United Kingdom, from the United States. And I had to deal with all these, most of whom I had to let down gently that we weren't going to be able to bring them up to McMaster, even though they looked very interesting. And then one time we got a very persistent fellow, who from the United States, and he had made a great case repeatedly why he should come up and talk about politics and American politics with the students here. And but eventually we certainly couldn't do it. I didn't know much about him. He was a quirky mayor down in the United States, and so we basically passed over him. But I just want to read the ending of one of his letters to me as he signed off. His letters were signed, "Sincerely, the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Bernard Sanders." So there's a local opportunity, a lost opportunity. Who knew? Who knew? My wife is very upset. She thinks the guy's absolutely great, and I think so as well. That was 1989. I didn't have the foresight, but there's plenty of times when I had lost opportunities as well as mistakes. But my task here today is to engage you in a discussion with you about a problem that I'm increasingly concerned about, and that is the lack of civility in legislatures, particularly the Ontario legislature, but I think all our legislatures, especially during question period. So, and it's a very foolhardy topic for me to pick because you all know more about it than I do. So what am I doing here? Throwing out some ideas. I have about 8 ideas. But I'll throw them out and let you go after me, and I expect plenty of criticisms. A lot of those ideas I picked up for my 11 years, wonderful 11 years as the program director of the Ontario Legislature Internship Program. It allowed me to spend a lot of time with the politicians who were at Queen's Park in those days. Where's it? Dave? Dave's around. Yeah, Dave, of course, is here. And other politicians. Judy was in there for a while. But I spent a lot of time going to receptions, talking to them. And of course, my interns would report back to me what was really happening in the rooms, the rooms of the MPPs and the backbenchers, and how they had to deal with, the staffers who were there and all that sort of thing. So I picked up a lot of that. So that I owe a lot to them and the understanding of understanding how legislators work. As I said, I've also spent a lot of time talking to legislators in the United Kingdom, particularly with the internship program. I went over for a week every year, those 11 years. And also in the U.S. where I came from. As I said, I started out when I was 12, and I was always interested. I loved going to political meetings, and I always was interested in the politicians who came from different parties and how they related to one another. And I knew they had their own positions. They were all trying to win. But I was always interested of how they treated each other, and that was a topic I've always been interested in. Unfortunately, I've never written a great deal about it, although some of my interns have written about that, and I learned from them. So you all have a great deal of, I hope, a lot to say about what I might say. I'm going to make eight proposals that I think hopefully will lead to more of to better discussion inside the legislature if they were possibly adopted. I would ask that you think when you do talk. I mean, the easiest thing would say this will never happen, and that's probably right. But I'd rather have people discuss whether, in fact, they would lead to more civil discourse inside the legislature. So the basic problem is I want to get more civility inside the legislature, especially in question period, and I begin by looking at it and say, well, where is the problem? Who's causing the problem? And I don't want to play up to you people, but I'm going to say is I don't really believe the problem is the members in the legislature. I really think the problem in the legislature is the political staff of all the parties. That's my impression. I think that they, in fact, are the ones who are they're too partisan. In some ways, I find them much more partisan than the members. I think they are major beneficiaries of political victory, and they're very much aware of it. Their positions and their whole importance really depends on their party winning, and for them, so they're very much concerned about it. And it's the power of these staffers that I think is really a problem, and who we sometimes refer to as the boys and girls in short pants, giving orders to the people like you, the legislators, as to what they should be doing. So how can we? So I look at ways, try to think of ways. Are the ways that the rules can be changed to limit the power of these party staffers and let the members have more influence inside the legislature, a position to which you are elected by the people. So how can we reduce, for example, the power of the staffers over the questions that are asked? Who will ask these questions? Who will respond to these questions? I think the staffers, in my view, have too much power over that. Maybe I'm too influenced about what's happening today, but I suspect that given what I've heard from my interns in the past, that probably was important in past years, but maybe not as much as they are possibly today. So I would like to have both the speaker and the members more in control of what is happening in the legislature, particularly in question period. So the first thing I would do is I have 8 suggestions. So the first one I would do is I would limit the number of questions that members could ask, and I would limit them to just one question and no supplementary. I would allow them to make more time to ask their questions, and I would allow the responder to make more time. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. I think the second question tends to be nastier and elicit a nastier response. So I'd like to get rid of that. And I noticed that in Westminster, generally they don't have a second question. And I think in Westminster, I really think the tone is much better than it is in, say, the Ontario legislature or our House of Commons. So that would be the first thing. I would limit the question. So that would also get more MPPs involved in the question period, because you'd only be able to ask one question. However, I would allow the leaders or leader of official parties to ask 4 questions. So I recognize the importance that they have in asking questions, particularly to the First Minister, the Prime Minister, or the Premier. So I would give them 4 questions. And again, a little more time to ask their question, a little more time for a response by the Premier or Prime Minister. And I think so more people would be involved in the question period, and I personally think that would be beneficial. Also, what I would do third is I would assuming a 60-minute question period, I would allow the speaker to decide after 40 minutes who would actually ask questions. Now, my impression is that the backroom people decide who's going to ask the questions, who's going to respond, and that's pretty much in their hands, and the speaker has relatively little to say about that. Maybe I'm wrong about that, maybe currently or in the past, but that's my impression. certainly I do recognize, and again, I watch every Saturday, I watch Prime Minister's Question Time from Westminster. And of course, I see all people trying to catch the eye of the speaker. And I think the speaker ought to be able to decide, at least for 20 of the minutes, who's going to speak, irrespective of what the backroom people of the parties want to happen. The speaker could use that in a number of ways. For example, the speaker could use that as a disciplinary tactic. That is, the speaker could decide, well, somebody who acts up all the time is not going to catch the eye of the speaker. Or somebody who is very insulting to the other members is going to have a great deal of trouble asking a question. Also, which I think to me is a sin in our legislature, to try to limit softball questions. So backbench members of the government who ask the most insipid softball questions, I think shouldn't be allowed to ask them. I see backbenchers in the Westminster Parliament, they sometimes ask some tough questions, relatively tough questions of their own party, and I think that's fine. But the softball questions I hear when I'm watching the question period on the parliamentary channel, I just can't bear to listen to it. I just find it so sickening. Anyways, and I think most other people would too. Fourth, members should be allowed to use proper names instead of just their constituency or where they're from. I notice again in Westminster they can use people's names. I guess what I worry about, and I may be wrong on this, is I think if you mention that you call people by the name of their constituency or minister by their portfolio, and somehow you depersonalize them. You sort of build up a barrier between the two. And I think it's much, much better to be able to address people by their proper names. We all know what constituencies they represent. I think there's no reason why you can't do that inside the legislature, and I think it might be a salutary effect, have a salutary effect. Again, maybe I'm wrong. Fifth, I would try to get all three parties to agree, the House leaders and everybody else, to ban clapping in the legislature or desk banging. The problem with clapping and the desk, there's all sorts of problems wrong with that, but what it does is it gives the impression that you don't want to hear the opposition. You don't want to hear anybody who disagrees with you. And I think in order to increase the legitimacy of the legislature, you have to give the impression to the public, if they're watching it, that you're really listening to the people who disagree with you. And I think this clapping and desk banging by the members takes away from that. And even incredible, now today, where people are clapping while their own member or premier are talking, you don't even know what they're saying because you hear the clapping drowns it out. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. But in any event, I think that needs to be done. Sixth, members should be, members should be allowed only 2 strikes and you're out. I think if somebody misbehave, I think they should be named immediately by the speaker and be told essentially the second time you're out of the legislature. I just think that, there's just not enough. I just think that they let people stick around who really make too much trouble. When I was there probably should have never done this as a program director, but sometimes when I was having a drink with somebody in a certain situation and they were a very loud member of the legislature, I would tell them that. They were offended by what I had to say, and maybe I shouldn't say that to a member. Maybe they could go to the speaker or somebody else and say, get Jacek out of this program. But I would tell them, I said, you can cut in half what you're doing and still be effective, but you're just sounding foolish and bringing the whole legislature into disrepute. So I think quickly getting rid of people by the speaker is very important. Give them 2 strikes and out, and you'd have to get, of course, the agreement of all the parties that this is the rule that you're going to go. But I think speaking as an outsider and watching it, I can't see that you allow people more than a second chance there. Seventh, let's see. The speaker. This will be, I'm sure, very controversial. The one thing that bothers me about has always happened, and maybe it's happening more these days, is of course, but it's always happened, I guess. A good question is asked. the minister or the premier gets up and doesn't answer the question, immediately goes off within 2 seconds, finds another topic. The favorite one is, when you guys were in power. Well, we don't care about that. The question is about what's going on now. I won't say we don't care about it. We're talking about the audience. And I think the speaker should be allowed, if the speaker wants, is to, after the minister or the premier stops speaking, to say, well, in my opinion, the premier or the speaker didn't really answer the question, but I'll let you have one more chance to answer the question. I think that would be a bit embarrassing for them if the speaker said that, and give them a chance. Well, maybe they could run off again on talk about something that's entirely different, but at least you'd be a certain amount of embarrassment. And one thing I do like about the present speaker in Westminster, I love the way he embarrasses members who misbehave. It is my favorite part of watching Question Time from Westminster. And then eighth, let's see, what do I got here? My eyes aren't that good in the twilight, so let's see. The final one is about the handoffs. I really don't like when somebody asks a question of somebody who should know the answer and they hand it off to somebody else. Okay, oftentimes the premier these days, but it could work out to other people. If a person who's named in the question cannot answer the question, they ought to say, I just can't answer that question, and just sit down instead of handing it off. I think the question is directed at a certain person, and that person should display whether they can answer that question or not. Now, those are the sort of the 8 things that I would like to see, and I like to think if they were implemented, we have a chance of getting more civility. Whether that's practical or not is another question. But I want people to realize, all members should realize, this is my final paragraph, that there's all sorts of elementary school children in the galleries. They are shocked by the behavior they hear. Their teachers are embarrassed. How many teachers have told me, I only want to come here to the legislature on Fridays because I don't want them to see how these guys actually behave and they're actually working. They're a bad influence on my students. So I think the members have to realize they have to act as if they're interested in the questions being asked and that they're trying to engage in a rational debate. Of course, I realize that heckling and humor are part of our tradition, and I wouldn't want to take that away. But I just hear too much, especially when I'm sitting in the gallery. It's harder to see it on TV, but I'm sure the kids hear it when they're in the gallery. Too much of insults, terrible insults, including some that are sexual insults that I think are just absolutely intolerable. So in any event, those are the 8 things that I would propose as a result of my listening to what goes on in the legislature, listening to my interns, and contrasting that with what I hear at Westminster and what I've heard from other people. So on that, I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, it's my distinct pleasure to thank Dr. Henry Jacek for joining us today to offer us some very insightful, thoughtful ideas to perhaps improve the governance of our Ontario legislature and perhaps to identify a better leadership model. And we would be most appreciative of your information going forward as well. And on our behalf, please accept this token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure, and I'm glad. I knew everybody was going to want to talk a lot, and that's exactly what I wanted.
That's a small bottle of scotch.